We've done all of the analysis for our 3-star eco car problem. So now let's go over a sample memo that actually writes out all of our analysis in IRAC form. But before we go over this sample memo together, please read through the sample memo once for yourself. If you haven't done that already, please pause this video so that you can read over it and then resume the video. So go ahead and do that now. Okay, the first thing that you'll notice about this sample memo is that it starts off with our issue statement, or our issue question rather. This is the issue that we came up with together that included the relevant law and the relevant facts. So we're providing the reader with all of the context for our specific issue. It's letting the reader know the circumstances of our particular issue. Now, after the issue in IRAC comes the rule. So this is our rule right here. A 3-star eco car is defined by a California statute as, quote, a car that is at least partially powered by electricity and gets at least 30 miles per gallon. And in brackets here I noted that we have to give a citation for this rule. But as I said before, it isn't enough in IRAC to just give the citation. We have to give the rule itself, or at least the relevant portions of the rule itself, so that the reader can see for himself whether this rule applies. Now, this big section here after the rule is our analysis, or our application if you prefer. Our analysis or our application. And after our analysis comes our conclusion. Although Tyler's minivan is probably a car for purposes of California law and is at least partially powered by electricity, it likely does not meet the fuel economy requirement and so probably would not qualify as a 3-star eco car. Here's our conclusion. So you'll see that our sample memo follows the IRAC form perfectly. But besides following the IRAC form, there are a few things that I'd like to point out about the sample memo. The first thing is that we're using the specific facts as much as possible, the specific relevant facts, in our analysis. We don't just use the specific facts in our issue, we also use them in our analysis. So when we're talking about the car requirement, we point out specifically that Tyler's vehicle is a minivan. Likewise, when we're talking about the second element of whether it's partially powered by electricity, we note that the minivan is a hybrid electric gas vehicle that gets about 40% of its horsepower energy from stored electricity. And finally, for our third element, we point out specifically that the minivan gets 32 miles per gallon on the highway, and that it gets 24 miles per gallon in the city. We also point out the specific fact that Tyler lives and works in San Francisco. All right, so the reason we give these specific facts is because we want to show, not tell. We don't just want to say in this third element, for example, we don't just want to say, well, Tyler actually probably gets closer to 24 miles per gallon and expect the reader to just take our word for it. We need to give this specific fact so that the reader can see for himself or herself that this particular element is or is not met. Now, the second thing that I want to point out about the sample memo is that each one of these paragraphs in the analysis section is actually its own IRAC. Each one of these is a sub-issue that follows the IRAC form and does an analysis in the IRAC form on its own. The first element, the first sub-issue, is whether the minivan is a car, whether the vehicle is a car. And that's pointed out here in the very beginning by the first sentence and by this little heading here. Is this a car? The car requirement. The first element of the statute requires that the vehicle be a car. Now I'll skip over the rule for just a second, and we'll talk about the analysis. The analysis is talking about how the term car is often used to refer generally to any four-wheeled self-powered vehicle. And so we have a conclusion. It is likely that Tyler's minivan would be considered a car for purposes of the statute. This is a self-contained sub-IRAC. A self-contained sub-IRAC. It has its own issue, whether the vehicle is a car. It has its own analysis discussing what may or may not constitute a car, and it gives its own conclusion. Now the rule, the reason I left that out is this is a little bit different than our overall IRAC, because we don't have a rule that tells us what constitutes a car. We don't have a statute that tells us a car is blank. So we have to just use our common sense or our judgment to come up with that rule. But nevertheless, we're going to be applying that common sense rule to the specific facts. Right? The fact that it is a four-wheeled self-powered road vehicle. And so this really is its own IRAC. It is a sub-IRAC. It's its own analysis for this sub-issue. We have another sub-IRAC for our second element. The issue is, for this sub-IRAC, the issue is whether the vehicle is partially powered by electricity. We don't have a rule that tells us what constitutes partially powered by electricity, so we just have to use our common sense or our judgment. But we apply that judgment to the specific facts. The minivan is a hybrid electric gas vehicle. It gets 40% of its horsepower energy from stored electricity. So applying our best judgment of what constitutes partially powered by electricity, we reach our conclusion for this sub-issue. The second element of the statute is also met. And we do the same thing for the third element, the gas mileage requirement. Our issue for this third sub-issue is whether the vehicle gets at least 30 miles per gallon. Here again, we don't have a statute that tells us what is getting at least 30 miles per gallon. So we have to use our best judgment. But we apply that judgment rule to the specific facts. The specific facts are the vehicle gets 32 miles per gallon highway, Tyler lives and works in San Francisco, and the minivan gets 24 miles per gallon in the city. So by applying our common sense judgment to these specific facts, we reach our conclusion for this sub-issue. The minivan therefore likely does not satisfy the third element of the statute. Each one of these elements is addressed separately. They don't bleed into each other. The conclusion for this first paragraph is only the conclusion as to whether the minivan would be considered a car, because that's the issue for this analysis. Likewise here, our conclusion is the second element of the statute is met. It is partially powered by electricity. It's not talking about whether it's a car. It's not talking about whether it meets the gas mileage requirement. This is a self-contained sub-IRAC dealing only with this sub-issue of whether the vehicle is partially powered by electricity. And finally, one more example, the gas mileage requirement. Our sub-IRAC here only deals with that third element. Tyler's minivan therefore likely does not satisfy the third element of the statute. We're not talking in this paragraph at all about whether it's partially powered by electricity or whether the minivan would be considered a car, because that's not relevant to this issue. This issue, this sub-issue, is whether the vehicle gets at least 30 miles per gallon. So analysis can often consist of sub-analyses. And each sub-analysis will follow the IRAC form. We sometimes call it a sub-issue, a sub-IRAC, sub-analysis, but it's all referring to the same thing. These are all parts of our overall analysis. Now the last thing that I'm going to point out about this about this sample memo is the use of headings and transitions to make the reader's job easier. Right? This heading isn't just to identify or to help identify the issue for this sub-issue. Right? It does do that. It lets the reader know, okay, now we're talking about the car requirement. But the headings help the reader see very quickly what we're talking about in each one of these paragraphs. This heading, car requirement, lets the reader know that this paragraph right below the heading is talking about the car requirement element and only the car requirement element. This heading, partially powered by electricity, tells the reader that we are talking about the element of whether the vehicle is partially powered by electricity, and only that element. And finally, the gas mileage requirement heading tells the reader that we are talking about that element and only that element in this paragraph. And underneath the headings, between each element, we have a little transition to help the reader see how this paragraph that he or she is about to read, how that fits in with the overall analysis. This one says the first element of the statute requires that. Right? That's a very helpful clause to begin our paragraph because it tells the reader, I'm now about to talk about one of several elements that we're going to have to address. The first element of the statute requires that. You'll see that the first sentence of the next paragraph starts by saying, assuming the first element is met, the statute next requires that. So this is tying this paragraph into the context of the overall analysis. It's saying that, okay, assuming the first one is met, now the next thing we would want to address is as follows. And the last sub IRAC has a transition that says finally. Finally means, okay, we've gone through at least a couple of different elements and we've analyzed each one of those, and this is the last one of those that we're now going to analyze. These transitions really make the reader's job a lot easier in understanding how our analysis, our sub-analysis, fits into the overall IRAC of our sample memo.